Thank you, Angela. That's not the first time I've forgotten to do that. So that's very helpful. So I'll begin again that we have this question about whether a universal account of human flourishing is possible or worthwhile, and that this is an open question in our minds. It's something we want to try to delve into and figure out what sort of answer could be given to this. And we're working within a eudaimonic tradition, so it focuses on flourishing or eudaimonia. And in the research traditions in the social sciences, at least, this is widely believed to be universal. But what's really interesting is that no one stops to give a theoretical argument for why it should be thought of as universal. They just sort of make that assumption and jump in and go. And so that really struck us as an important kind of question to ask, is what would be the justification of that? Is it possible to justify it? So that's one issue that we want to focus on. The other one is that when you do that, what you tend to do is use the cultural resources you have at hand. And what that tends to mean in this field, and as in many others, is that you're going to get a fairly ethnocentric version. And if you listen to what I've said, people study that they tend to study subjective purpose and meaning, close personal relationships, and mastery or competence. That's pretty much the definition of the good life in the United States. So if you've got those things going, and maybe a few others. But if you go to other countries or other societies, they will not necessarily agree with those being the prime candidates for what it means to flourish. So this ethnocentrism is very important for us to address as well. Now, we've already written a critique of these two things, so I don't want really to spend our time on that so much, but rather on what you think some of the barriers and some of the opportunities are for this idea of a universal account of flourishing. But the universality is really strongly contested. And the most common way to contest that is to say that there are so many cultural differences that it doesn't make a lot of sense to talk about it as universal. So that's one of the things that I want to talk with you about today. And what we want to do is really examine this tension between culturally based or culturally relative views of flourishing, and whether there's something that might be core to that might apply to all human beings. And so that's the question we really want to do. So, and what we're interested in mostly is your input. So we really want to make this a conversation hour. So this little bit of an introduction is all the presenting we're really hoping to do. There might be some questions that will be important for us to answer as we go, but mostly we want to ask you questions and get your responses. So that's what we're going to try to do. So we structured the session with a set of questions that we're going to throw out to the group and have hopefully induce you to respond. But what I would ask you to do is to try to keep your responses brief. Let's not have too many speeches. We've only got an hour and a half together. And the more speeches we have, the less time we have for other people to participate. So try to keep that in mind as you go. Let me introduce my co-presenters. They're to my right, or to my left on the screen actually, is Alex Calder. You know, wave Alex, Nona Kiknadze, and Lucas Novak. So what we'll do is I'll start us off with the first question, and then we'll share the questions after that, and the other three presenters will head them up and try to elicit responses from you. So the first question I have is just, what are your thoughts about the concept of flourishing for humans? Do you see it as a meaningful topic or a useful topic for us to talk about? And that would be the first place where someone might object. They might just say, no, it's not useful, it's not meaningful. And if so, I'd be interested in why you think that way. And if you do think it's meaningful and useful, why do you think that way? So let me throw it out to you. To make this a little less awkward, you can raise your hands or something, and we can just take people in order. Go ahead, Dan.
I guess if I'm just thinking about this, you know, as far as first principles, you know, I'm thinking back to an essay. I can't remember who wrote it. I read it sometime in the 90s on the virtues of kvetching. That said that what's, you know, that there's something really oppressive about this idea that people need to be happy, which I know is not eudaimon. But it seems like it's like a potential challenge to that. But the idea that in just kind of complaining and being and embracing your misery gives you a sort of resilience. So I don't know if you've thought about that.
Oh, okay. So one thing that you would recommend us including in our account is how does misery fit in? How does suffering fit in? Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. Well, how many people here would like to live a good life? I think we're all kind of on board at some level, but we might have some worries or some objections, or we might be totally on board, might be on the train and chugging down the track. So I'm interested in your thoughts about that. Where are you on that?
I used the digital hand raising, so.
Oh, I see it. Got lost in your graphic there, Josh.
Yeah, okay, so it's always a little annoying to answer a question with a question, but I'm going to do that anyway. And just because this is a question I think I've had for a while, like how isomorphic is the notion of flourishing with the notion of values? Like how much do those ways of framing, human experience overlap? Could we consider them the same thing?
Recording in progress.
Well, I think it depends. Bruce, could you mute yourself? It looks like we're getting an echo. There we go. Thank you.
Gotta mute both of them, I think.
Yeah, it's kind of a problem with having two screens. There we go. Thank you. I think it depends, and some people would answer very close or almost identical, and other people would say maybe somewhat different. And part of the question depends on whether you mean an objective or universal type of count, or just simply a subjective one, both in values and in flourishing. So you could have an entirely subjective view of values or an entirely subjective view of flourishing. And those might or might not overlap. So I think there are lots of answers to that question. I mean, my answer to the question is they're very close. And I see values or goods as constituents of flourishing, but that's just my answer. So Monica, you had a thought.
Yes, I want to come back to the question of challenges, or what's a good life. I think, and I have also thought about this quite a bit, but I think challenges come automatically. The good life does not. So I think for me the trick is, how can you steer the course and have a good life in spite of these challenges that will come. And my focus has been on aging research and aging well. And trust me, when you get older, challenges will come automatically. You don't have to even look for them, because health declines, people that you love die. You might, your mental health, might have some challenges. So it's all these things. So the question is, how do you maintain satisfaction with life, subjective well-being? That's really what my focus has been, despite of all these challenges. And so one of the things that I have found is indeed purpose and meaning. If you have an existential purpose and meaning in life, then you can maintain it. And of course, what I've been studying is wisdom. So people who are high on wisdom, they are not. Their subjective well-being is not negatively affected by hardship in their life. And so when we looked, for example, at the difference, people who live in a nursing home have lower subjective well-being, right? People who are hospice patients, have a life expectancy of 6 months or less, lower life satisfaction than older people who live in the community. Again, not surprising. But the nursing home residents and those in hospice patients who were really high on wisdom, there was no difference. And so that's my question. How do they do it, right? How do they do it? And I think purpose in life, a sense of mastery, and resilience. This is, what really helps.
Okay. That's very helpful. Now, I couldn't agree with you more about that. And in fact, I'll just share an interesting book on this that happens to be by some of my favorite authors. But it's a really good reminder to incorporate that, just as Dan mentioned, that life isn't easy, and being able to having an account that can help to explain how we deal with life not being easy and yet still have a rich, full life, because I think it's very possible. I gave an interesting talk a week ago, and there was a person in the audience who is part of the Miami Project to Cure Paralysis. So he works with quadriplegics and paraplegics. He said, you need to come and do a study at our place, because what you will find is you'll find some exemplars of people who are flourishing and some who are really upset and angry about what's happened to them and they haven't come to grips with it in a good way. So something similar to what you're saying. I think there are ways to, one of the things we're going to want to do is find some stress tests for our theory. That once we come up with something, how well does it work in these difficult situations? Yeah, so this is a great idea.
And just for my research, I found there was one lady that I interviewed in the nursing home who was a quadriplegic, and I think she was a quadriplegic for 20 years as a result of a hit and run accident. I mean, basically, a car accident she had no fault of her own. She was in this situation, and she was still relatively young when this happened, in her 40s, I think. And she said, yes, I was very, very angry with God when this happened. I wanted him, why am I still alive? Why didn't I die? But now I've made peace with it, and I basically, I've learned that I'm here for a reason, and the reason is to spread God's love to others. And so this is amazing, and I think that reminded me of what you were saying, with other people, for some, the difference, right, how people deal with it, and it's not easy. It's clearly not easy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. Jim, did you raise your hand?
Yeah, I did. I got a million thoughts. I'm sorry, Blaine, because there's also things that are connecting with some work I'm doing right now.
Mhm.
But a connection that I'm curious if you looked into is Ignatieff. He has a book coming out on consolation. And what you've been talking about really resonates with this idea of consolation, which is making meaning with others.
Mhm.
That seemed to touch on. I think it was Monica that was just speaking. So I don't know if there's. I mean, there's always a book we haven't read, right? There's always, but but the idea of consolation, and there seems to be some sort of connection here. That's all I was going to say.
Great, thank you. Let me just ask you, is that, you mentioned making meaning with others, is that a theme of the book?
Yeah, well, it's not out yet, so I'll put a link to the in the chat. How about that? It's coming out very soon if it's not out right away.
Okay, great suggestion. I'm especially interested in transcending subjective meaning, because that's what we tend to focus on, and that's important, of course, but we get those ideas and meanings from somewhere, and if we don't have them coordinated with other people, we're kind of in trouble. If it's just my own idiosyncratic ideas, then it's going to be hard to maintain as a meaningful point of view. Okay, great. This is very helpful so far. Yeah. Let's switch to the second question. Oh, go ahead.
Pasha has her hand up there.
Pasha, go ahead.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And this conversation, I think I, like Jim, have a million thoughts, but one of the things that I'm considering, and arguably the reason why I'm here, is, yeah, what counts as flourishing? And I'm wondering, Blaine, given your book, I'm wondering what cases you examined to come to an account of flourishing, as I think whether we can consider it to be a universal characteristic sort of depends on how broadly or narrowly we want to look at cases, in the sense of, I think on a case by case basis, it will look differently phenomenologically. But of course, our job as researchers is to identify patterns and experiences and say something more general. And so, and I also, so I'm sort of interested in how you've approached what you've sort of distilled from your work analyzing flourishing in different cases. And then just as a side and sort of context for where I'm coming from is, as some persons in the room know, my work focuses on immigration, and I've done quite a bit of work with undocumented young people. And there's a growing focus on their experiences of flourishing, actually, in the face of the particular challenges that they face, the uncertainty, fears of deportation, instability at home, financial insecurity, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think their account of flourishing, their experience of flourishing is going to be very different than, say, the cases that Monica just described. But we could talk about consolation, or we could talk about facing those challenges, and the practice of flourishing as something, that is shared across groups. So I'm interested in what the group's take is on flourishing as it stands. I think there's a kind of iterative process here, right, of what we pull out meaningfully and then what we see in the cases, et cetera. So what has thus far been outside, is there something more specific outside of the three sort of subjective meaning you mentioned, mastery, and I forget the third one. I had written it down.
Close personal relationships.
Yeah. Is there something else that you could add to that?
Oh, yeah, that's just the foci of the most prominent models and measures of flourishing in the field. So that's not necessarily our focus. So what we just recognize that those seem important, particularly if you're from the US or Europe, but they don't seem particularly culturally applicable because there are really dramatic counterexamples of them. So one thing that I'm taking from what you're saying is the importance of making the account capacious enough that there's room for quite a bit of variability within it. Now, the challenge then is to identify patterns that apply across the variability. So I'll just give you one example, but I'm also really interested in hearing what you're seeing in this literature on immigrant youth and flourishing. Because that's another kind of stress test for anything we come up with. This is an unusual situation, people changing the societies in which they live and all the challenges that are associated with that. So one example I'll give would be the example of meaning. In the US and among psychologists in particular, subjective meaning rules the day. And it's a matter of whether the individual sees their life as meaningful and as purposive, not so much whether they're fitting into some meaning or purpose that's bigger than them. Now, for some people, that subjective sense of meaning is going to come from that, but it doesn't necessarily have to. Whereas if you go to many cultures around the world, you would find something quite different, that the meaning is available to them in their society, in their membership in the group, in their relationship with nature or with the deity or deities, and not so much within their subjective experience. So what we're thinking is with something like this, a category like meaning in life is capacious enough to accommodate both of those views. But what you have to do is differentiate them and realize that for some people, this is the task of the individual to develop this, and it's a burden that each individual has to manage. On the other hand, in some societies, meaning is more readily available, and it may even be quite implicit. And it's oftentimes explicit for people where it's an individual subjective thing. So that's one example of how we might do that. But would you mind sharing a little bit about what's coming up in the flourishing literature and immigrant youth? I'm fascinated.
Yeah, no, likewise. And I appreciate your interest. I won't give a speech,
Thank you.
but I will say that it's definitely very fresh. And I think actually young scholars have taken this up. In order to account for a sort of deficit approach to the research literature on undocumented immigrants, really. So I'm not necessarily, so I wouldn't, I shouldn't start with a deficit perspective on the flourishing approach, but the research really starts from examining young people as they overcome challenges and sort of focusing in immigrant youth in particular, immigrant young people, and sort of focusing on their resilience, on their capacity for agency, on their, how they reshape environments, how they participate in advocacy, and as examples of ways in which they sort of don't let the system get to them. So I would say that the focus is on that side of their experience and not necessarily a complex account of how they approach challenge. How should I put this? It's sort of in a way to go against accounts that focus exclusively on their struggles. I would like to see more complex accounts of what flourishing means in the face of challenges, but my sort of hidden criticism is that they're a bit flat, these accounts. But the idea being that, undocumented young people are not just victims of circumstance, they're not just struggling individuals, but in fact, develop and apply various strategies to overcome the unique challenges that they face. So in that sense, it's very unique to their experience because it deals with, deportation and so forth and uncertainty caused by their immigration status. Yeah, that would be my short answer.
Okay, yeah, no, that's really great stuff. And what it suggests to me is the importance of incorporating some concept of agency, that people are not just flourishing because they happen to be born in the right place in the right time and have a lot of privileges, but people have something to say about that and they can change their environments.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And I think the flourishing literature is helping sort of pull that out of their experience for sure. But yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Appreciate it. So let's try to do one or two quick things, and we'll move on to the second question because I don't want to hog the whole thing.
There's a couple of hands that are still up, Blaine, in case you're.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So Jack, what was your thought?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I've had so many more thoughts after hearing what Basha's saying, but we can get to that. But just the general idea of flourishing, I think there's this idea that is, I keep seeing this in manuscripts and in review comments, that there's this view that flourishing is like an either or kind of thing, that either you're flourishing or not. And that it's like, and it's also the state of like perpetual bliss, and that's what flourishing is. And if we can just get past that and just start from as an assumption, no, we're not talking about that. First of all, I don't know that we can get to that point, but at least not, it seems like there's something like that now, because I'm hearing a lot of people, it's just the idea that, even the question, can you flourish while they're suffering? Can you flourish if you're in a marginalized situation? Is to say, well, if the answer is no, well then, okay, then let's not even study it, and who cares? Or some people can study it if they want, fine, it's a big world. But the main thing is, in what ways, instead of looking at a person, and usually, and this is coming very much from it's not like it's from like a virtue ethics kind of thing where it's the person is flourishing. I would say, why don't we say that there are like many dimensions of flourishing on which any individual, if you're going to measure it that way, which we do, could be considered to be flourishing or not. And if you want to pose some kind of absolute threshold on that, sure, go ahead. But most of us are interested in things like individual differences, and to the degree you tend to be flourishing in this particular way, what does that correlate with? What does it predict? These kinds of things. And so I think it's, I love the fact that eudaimonia or eudaimonia is not yet defined. That's good. That's where we are in humanity, I think, at this stage, in understanding ourselves and how we work. And so let's work with that. We can measure what we can and see what goes with what. So I would not like to rush to the conclusion that we have to define it in any particular way, and that we consider that it's complex. So.
Okay. Yeah, that's great input. So I think the idea, sort of, you seem to imply the idea of some sort of profile of flourishing, that there are multiple dimensions.
Yeah.
Any given individual might be doing well on some and not so well on others. Some might be more important to the individual than others. Similar at the cultural level, we could have that same kind of thing happening, where certain things are really important in one environment, but not so important in another.
Exactly.
I like that idea,
Yeah.
and the idea that it's not a dichotomy, and that we should avoid any kind of perfectionistic ideas.
I like the idea that you should create a profile. I think that's what that's the view is, that flourishing is a single thing, and it's a single dimensional profile. And even if they're like a few dimensions, but it's just so complex. And then with the resources, whether it's intrapsychological or it's cultural, societal, structural, hegemonic, all these different forces will make it more or less likely, give fewer affordances to make any one of those particular dimensions happen.
Great.
Yeah.
I see your hand, Dan, but I'm really compelled to throw Nona to the line. I mean, to let her ask a question. Go ahead, Nona.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. This has been a great discussion so far, and I'm just going to move on to the next question, which I think ties in really well to what's already been said. So overall, there are 8 widely cited psychological models and measures of flourishing, and all of them assume that flourishing is virtually the same for all humans, regardless of culture or history. So I want to raise the question then, how do you react to that assumption? And before I do that, I'm also going to share a graphic that lists the top 8 measures that we're talking about, just so you have some frame of reference for understanding that point.
So you know what these abbreviations mean. I wouldn't worry too much about the inclusion criteria. The PERMA is Marty Seligman's model in his most recent book, and I think it's 2012 is his most recent book. CIT is a comprehensive inventory of thriving. I don't remember all these. QEWB is the eudaimonic well-being. What's the Q for? I forget.
Question.
So anyway, maybe I shouldn't be the one to say these things because I don't remember them that well. Do you want to spell them out, Lucas or Nona?
Sure. Secure Flourishing Index is Vanderweel's, PERMA, the European Social Survey by Hooper et al., Questionnaire for Eudaimonic Wellbeing, Flourishing Scale, the Mental Health Continuum by Keyes, and the Psychological Wellbeing Scale by Riff.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So only some of these will use the notion of flourishing, or do they all actually explicitly reference the idea of flourishing?
Go ahead, Lucas.
Well, I didn't know if Nona wanted to take that one.
I can jump in, and then if I miss anything. So they all do explicitly try and capture what they define as flourishing, but in some cases it's described as eudaimonia or eudaimonic well-being, but they all specify that this is broader than just something measuring positive affect or life satisfaction, that it's multifaceted, that they're trying to get at the same kind of complex form of well-being that we've been discussing.
And just another follow-up, how much cross-cultural validation have they done with these across these various measures?
And that's a great question. And that's one of the big problems with this literature. They've done psychometric validation. So they've translated it into several different languages and then exported those translations to different cultures, measuring the kind of statistical properties of the measure rather than if they actually make sense or represent a different kind of cultural worldview. And so that's one of the biggest issues we've seen, is that they're making these big claims to universality, whereas the research that's being done isn't necessarily taking that into account.
So there's a significant gesture in that direction, these various authors and the people who use their measures have gone to great lengths and spent a lot of money trying to get some data from other cultures. But as Nona said, they basically just import their views into these other cultures without questioning whether the degree of fit of those views to the culture in which they're measuring. Nona, do you want to call on participants, or do you want me to?
You can go ahead and do that, Blaine. I'm having trouble seeing it with my screen being shared.
Okay. So Monica, you raised your hand right off the bat.
Well, yes. It would be nice, actually. Here's a problem, and I have kind of struggled with this as well in terms of like, how do you measure, for example, purpose in life. And so it would be nice to actually see what the subscales are. But even if you see the subscales, in some ways this isn't enough. You actually have to see the individual items. And let me give you the example of purpose in life. Because when I was starting my research, I was looking for a good purpose in life scale. And the reform purpose in life, was kind of, I don't know, I didn't quite like it. Then there was another purpose in life. This comes from Frankel's idea of purpose in life, but a lot of the items were overlapping already with well-being. I mean, if you wanted to measure purpose in life, it shouldn't measure well-being, right? So I ended up basically picking 3 items, just 3 pure items, what I call pure purpose and meaning items. And there's a difference between purpose and meaning, I know. So but it's tricky, right? So the whole thing is tricky because some of these are geared, I think, towards certain cultures. And the other thing is PERMA, the wisdom scale that they do have a measure of wisdom, but it's very much Western oriented. It's very much knowledge, cognitive oriented, which I wouldn't agree with. So you would really have to look at not just the subscales, but the items, and then decide item by item, right? Is this kind of universal, or is this geared toward a certain culture or not? So if there is an item like for purpose in life, I have found great purpose and meaning in life. I say, well, yeah, that's fine, right? It's very open, right? Or, sometimes I don't know, what the purpose of my life is, reversed, yeah, kind of. But if it gets much more specific, then maybe not. But even that, I just want to mention this. We did we did kind of a cross-cultural international study. And these 3 items, purpose and meaning in life, and it didn't work in China at all. They didn't hang together. I don't know why, but they just didn't hang together in China, right? So this is, I think, really, you have to really look at these at the item level.
Go ahead, Lucas, you're grinning. I think you have a response.
Yeah, I do just want to say we have a big spreadsheet with every single item from every single measure, and we've done all kinds of analysis on them, and we're writing a paper about it. So there's really cool differences, just like you're saying, that when you zoom in at the items, it's different than it might appear. But I want to leave space. There's so many hands up, so I'm excited to see what people have to say.
Okay. So what's your thought, Dan?
So I hope everyone will forgive me because I'm not familiar with this literature. So I'm just really kind of thinking about first principles foundation. So can you guys walk me through how you would do this? Back to what I was, the way that I opened with this idea of kvetching, of people just kind of embracing, that either life is pain or that there's actually just something about kind of contemplating and intensifying suffering that gives people a certain sort of resilience. So how do you, if you want to make a universal cross-cultural view of flourishing, how do you get away from kind of I think that the hedonic features that are there in Aristotelian eudaimonia? This idea that you want to at least find some ideal balance of some golden mean of pleasure, of happiness. That how do you have a sense of flourishing that doesn't just tolerate and deal with suffering, but actually embraces it, or is that in some way contrary to this?
I think that's an interesting question about many cultural and worldview differences. So if you just take the quickest understanding of Buddhism, that life is suffering, then that's where you start. And then there is a way through Buddhism to transcend the suffering by moving beyond many of the concerns of life and embracing loving kindness and compassion, and letting go of a lot of things. So there, even though the suffering is part of it, what you have also is a pathway for how you can move beyond it. So I think that would be one approach. Another approach might be that life is suffering, there isn't a pathway beyond it. So I think there's a lot of different ways you could go with that. And one of the things we'll have to look at is how some of these traditions deal with this question. So I think the question of suffering and challenges is really important, because I don't know anybody who's had a totally easy life. There might be some people like that, but I don't know them. So I think we're all have to struggle to some degree. And then the question is, how can we make the best life possible given those constraints and challenges and sufferings that are inevitable? So let's go on to Jim's thought.
Hey, thanks, folks. Monica, I'm so sorry, but I'm gonna, if it's okay with you, I'd like to just really disagree and go in a very different direction, if that's okay. Because I think it's the problem, chasing and looking at scales is not helpful, because I don't think we're dealing with an individualistic phenomena that's a property of an individual that can be assessed via a scale. I'd argue that flourishing is like a dialogical or interactional, those of you who know my background, aesthetic phenomena, where to flourish, I can't flourish on my own. I can only flourish with the other who consummates it, right? And so we're dealing with a fundamentally non-individualist perspective, right? And it's an interactional one. And so I think chasing scales to find a universal is actually not, you're just, all you're doing is taking the phenomena, throwing a little bit of kind of neoliberal self-absorption over top of it, and then pretending as if we are now measuring something universal. But I think what you're looking at with human flourishing is something that is a universal of a much broader sort, that is about I in relation to the other. And it's a fundamentally interactional phenomena, qualitatively different from what like what Monica's talking about in terms of items and that sort of thing. And the reason I think it's really important to think about it as an interactional phenomenon is it gets us out of kind of these colonial mindsets of individual ownership, kind of capitalist ways of thinking, like all that sort of stuff, which is probably a good thing if we want to start talking about flourishing. So I would actually like to turn the tables and rethink the ontology of flourishing here. I hope that's actually maybe not that I hope. I worry this is like an ideological grenade, but I kind of this is how I'd kind of think about it here.
Well, here's how I'd reframe that a little bit. I take your point, and I think it's a really great one, is that the part of the question for us is going to be, to what degree do we describe this in individual terms? And to what degree is it a communal phenomenon? And how does that tension resolve, or is it something that is just part of the notion of flourishing? But one thing I really agree strongly with you about, Jim, is that we can't neglect the communal part of it. And that's one of the things we learn in a huge way in the cross-cultural literature, is that there are many places where that's the primary focus of how to live well, is in the community, not at the individual level. So it's a really interesting point. I think we need to spend some more time with it. So if I remember right, it seemed like Jack was the next hand.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I'll try to keep this kind of quick. I'm really glad to hear that, Jim, because it was one of the thoughts that the idea of chasing scales is, I mean, it's you know, at the extreme view, you know, it can, you know, in the effort of decolonizing psychology, one way we do it, decolonizing, yeah, is to not just export. I think that was the word you used, Blaine, you know, these scales everywhere else. And, you know, that's the, on the other hand, I don't know, I think it's a big world out there. I think we need to do both. I think we need to be exporting scales, and I think we need to do, especially, there just needs to be a lot more effort and money put into not so much cross-cultural psychology, but cultural psychology, which is the thicker view of the view. And I think that gets at some of the things that Basha was saying about, you know, getting inside the mind of these immigrant youth is how you understand what flourishing is in that context. And so that's one thing. So, but, you know, we learn stuff from all these measures and all these findings. I don't know. Anyway, and then also the idea of all those measures. Blaine, you had brought up Dan Hebron, and his work was the first that I even thought of. Wait, it's not a subjective objective difference, it's an internalist externalist difference. And philosophically, internalist measures or thoughts or constructs are about, the question is who benefits. So you're saying, you know, when you give somebody an item, is the beneficiary of a high score on that item the individual who's answering it? Or is it someone else, other people, society, whatever it be? If it's other people, that's more externalist, and actually an externalist view includes the internalist stuff too. So it's not like an either or thing, it's more incorporative. And, or is it really just about the individual's own well-being, which is usually what most self-report scales are. There's some difference in that list that you had on there. You had Corey Keyes. That tends to be the social well-being type of stuff. That tends to get to a little bit more externalist. The CIT measure has an item or two, I think, that's on community, but for the most part, it's more internalist. So these are just some considerations that, you know, and that's to get beyond the individual person and beyond the culturally individualist orientation, so that we might understand what would things be like somewhere else. Just even the thought, the impulse that maybe these items or the way that I'm viewing things is not quite translatable is a starting point, I think, for research.
Okay, yeah, that's very helpful, Jack. Thank you. So Lucas, were you reacting to something, or?
Yeah, I mean, I can wait until after Basha. I actually just wanted to, I thought, respond to something Dan said. I can do it now or two.
Right, yeah.
So Dan, you brought up Aristotle's original eudaimonic conception. I thought you're actually sort of getting to some of the really hard-hitting questions. And so I just want to bring them up because Aristotle didn't really have as much of a focus on positive emotion as we do today. And the translation of eudaimonia as happiness is often wrong. And a synonym for the eudaimonia that Aristotle uses sometimes is makarios, which means blessed or lucky. And the Aristotelian view of eudaimonia is a bit more savage, I think, than is palatable oftentimes to modern sensibility. And so it brings up these two provocative questions. One, can everyone flourish? Aristotle would give a resounding no. He would say you have to be lucky. And two, can people be wrong about if they're flourishing or not? And I think these are two kind of hard questions we encounter when we talk about a universal account. So I just want to bring those up. I thought that the questions were very thought-provoking.
Appreciate it. Yeah. You're up, Basha.
All right, appreciate that. And I do also want to just put in one thing, an idea to consider, because I did appreciate also Jim's push for a kind of relational or dialogical account of flourishing. And I'm in agreement in that. I think it would account for the kind of complexity of the structure of human experience and the dynamics of human experience, which is also then what I wanted to highlight in my addition to that, which is thinking of flourishing more as a practice than a characteristic, right? We do flourishing and we do it in different ways at different times, in different contexts. And then just to the comment about methodologically sort of identifying it, I think some methodologies, surveys, ethnographies, interviews lend themselves to different kinds of allow us to explore different aspects of that human experience. So I don't know if I agree that a sort of richer qualitative approach would lend itself more to this kind of complex account, though I do see also the points made about being able to explore some things through other kinds of research. So anyway, thank you.
Yeah, I think that's helpful because we don't often recognize, or at least many of our colleagues don't often recognize, I think people in this group tend to, that our methods predetermine our results to a large degree. What's possible to find is constrained by how we look. And so just as flourishing is a practice, so is research. And if we practice it in particular ways, we're likely to get particular ends. So I hear you advocating for a kind of methodological pluralism, that we're not limiting ourselves to one kind of thing, which is one of the things we have noticed about this literature, is that it's primarily devoted to single time point self-report scales. And while that can be useful and informative, it's also very limited in various ways. And so qualitative research is one alternative. Other reports of someone's flourishing is another kind of alternative. So there are some physiological markers that go pretty strongly with other indicators of flourishing that might help. So I think having some variety in that would at least open us up to not being terribly constrained in what we're finding. So appreciate that. So Monica, you had a thought or a rejoinder or something?
Right. I just wanted to address what Jim was saying. In the end, yes, you're absolutely right. That the community matters. You're not. We are social beings. We are not individuals. Even so, in America, people think we are individuals, but all over the world, the rest of the world, they realize that this is not the case. And so, absolutely, the community matters, right? If you have a community that promotes flourishing, then it's much easier for the individual to flourish than in a community that promotes individualism also through the education system. And you see this in American schools, where individualism, basically in kindergarten, is emphasized. And so in this way, culture matters. But the other thing is a measurement issue, right? Where do you find it, right? Do you find it in the community, or do you find it in people in the community? And so if you go in and these survey scales are basically there to find out the level of flourishing in individuals. I completely agree with you, and this is my preferred method. It's actually a mixed method, right? So you have quantitative, qualitative. And so it would really be interesting, for example, to compare a flourishing community and a more individualistic community and then see what the differences are. And you can do this in different cultures and what it means. Or doing, some ethnographic research. You can do interviews, but ethnographic research would be particularly interesting together with interviews. But the advantage, of course, of quantitative research and survey research is that you get larger numbers, and then you can do it cross-culturally. You can compare this, rather than with qualitative research, it's much harder to get larger numbers, and even if you do get larger number, then it becomes meaningless. So I think it's a measurement approach rather than necessarily, where is it? But let's just, is it really in the community if it's not in the individual? In the end, what is it? If we define flourishing at this satisfaction, purpose, or something like this related with this sense of well-being, how I define it, eudaimonic well-being, right? Where is it? Where is it located? In the end, I think it's located in individuals. Of course, supported by the community. Yes.
Josh, you had a thought about that or something else?
Something else. So if I don't want to drop another ideological hand grenade or anything, but the last, long time I've been studying, the kind of history, the social structure of science. And one of the lessons I feel like I've learned from that is to have skepticism about any idea that's not connected to its use, like how it will be deployed economically, culturally, socially, politically. So I wonder I don't know if there is a single answer to how might the notion of flourishing be used, but maybe what are some of the ways that it might be used? Because I really think that how something is deployed really shapes what it means and what conclusions that you can draw from it. And by deployed, I mean how's it going to actually shape the world? How's this idea is it going to be used in clinical settings? Is it going to be used the way that psychology usually uses ideas, which is the scientific management of the masses for the benefit of the wealthy? Or how is this idea going to be deployed?
I thought you weren't going to do ideological grenades.
Sorry, there's a big one. I said I didn't want to. I didn't say I wouldn't.
Oh, okay. Fair enough. I think that's a great segue into the third question we had in mind that Alex Calder was going to talk about with you in terms of the desirability of an idea of flourishing. Because one of the questions you're raising, Josh, is that if it's going to be used in an oppressive way or in a restrictive way or in some way that we don't like, maybe it's not even desirable to have it. We should get out of the business of studying it because it's going to be used to marginalize or categorize or some other nasty thing. So Alex, you want to introduce that question and get us going?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Well, that is the question. Is it desirable to have a universal account of flourishing? So we've touched on this, I guess, in a number of different ways, but we haven't asked this question exactly like that. So what are your thoughts about how desirable is it to have a universal account? What are some complications to that? Sure. Mary, please.
Okay, so I have a question about this, beginning with the idea of even getting to making meaning as necessary for flourishing, and what does making meaning mean? So if I go to the reference you made earlier, Blaine, I think, to suffering in Buddhism, another translation of that term, dukkha, suffering, is unsatisfactoriness. And I find, particularly today, I just finished a novel about a tragic life. I just had a wonderful, exciting project have a hard twist. So those are two examples of things that are discouraging about my meaning making. My efforts to make meaning are often unsatisfactory. It's satisfying. I mean, it's satisfying to do that, but the results aren't satisfactory. So what I do in those cases is fall into a much simpler lifestyle. You know, I don't give up my thinking, my desires, my goals, but I focus more on my health, getting enough sleep, working in the yard, cleaning the house, being a body, experiencing my body from the inside. And I think that might be a more universal response to the challenges of accessing a life that is rich and rewarding. I don't know if flourishing is the right word, maybe flourishing. And then just to share one other example, immediate example, I just heard a woman speaking about her 3 sons. 2 of them had a really easy time through all their studies, their graduate studies into their professions. One of them had a really hard time. The one that had a really hard time is the one who I would describe as flourishing, because he's really more richly engaged in his whole life and actually more successful than the other 2. So I hope that's not too many words, or if it's useful ideas to consider.
Appreciate it. I mean, one of the things you're saying is that we tend to focus on the psychological or maybe on the relational, but you're suggesting maybe also on the idea of embodiment and
Yeah.
how it is that we as physical beings can do well or not do well, or how our actions physically might impact our psychology or relationships. So,
Yeah.
am I getting it right?
Yeah, that's right.
Sure, Gary.
For me, I agree. I agree with what Josh was getting at. The burning question is, what are you going to do with this concept of flourishing? And on the matter of whether a universal concept is desirable, I would say that everyone individually must have a notion of what flourishing is. It's like having a notion of what is good and what is bad. And if you want a world, a survivable world, when we have so many weapons and so much interdependency, my gut feeling is that a universal notion of flourishing actually is very important, even recognizing all the differences.
And when you're saying, so everyone, thank you, first of all. And I like how you said everyone kind of has this implicit understanding or like idea about what flourishing is. Do those come in conflict? Like, and if they come in conflict, you know, between individuals or between groups, how can they be reconciled?
The question is, can they be reconciled?
Mm-hmm.
Again, I'll go with my gut feeling. Getting back to the fact that we all have similar bodies and we all suffer and we all have tragedy in our lives and ways of responding to it, then I would think that we could find a way. Maybe we could all agree on the absence of suffering. Physical pain is bad. I think most people would think that, although you can say without some physical pain, you're not going to have happiness one way or another. But, you know, if there are enough differences and some of those people who disagree have nuclear weapons or biological weapons, then we're all in trouble. So if we can come up with some kind of a core sense that cross-culturally we can agree on, like not killing each other for no reason is a good thing, you know, then we can get along. And if we can somehow all agree on a universal notion of flourishing, you know, just this is science fiction, you know, futuristic. Maybe we can imagine a world, you know, something like a utopia.
Okay, that's helpful, Gary. It's the idea that there might be some really positive uses of this idea that might help to influence the way world events progress. I like that idea. Yeah.
Monica, I think you had your hand up.
I do. I like this very much, Gary, what you were saying. And I was also thinking maybe we cannot agree what flourishing is for each and every individual. It might be different for some people. Some people might want to do this and some people want to more focus on this. But I think in some ways we can agree that certain things are just not good, right? Suffering, who wants to suffer, right? Who wants to live in poverty? Who wants to have hunger, right? Who wants to be homeless? I mean, some people might, but anyway, but in general, right? If you think about these, who wants to live, in a war zone, So if we can do this, the opposite, if we can provide that, the basics, to enable people then to flourish, I think there could be, some kind of agreement, a general agreement. I found, I read this book by Kane, and what's the title? I think it's was something with wisdom and something, ethics and the search for wisdom or something like this. But the interesting thing, what he was saying is basically, as a minimum, if we as long as people, do not break the ethical contract. I mean, basically, you can have freedom. Provide freedom for people to live their life as long, right, they don't break the ethical contract to prevent other people to live their life as they want it. So basically, you have this open and the positive front is open. There are different ways how people can flourish. But on the negative side, it's not good, if you exploit people, if you kill people, if they don't have enough to eat and things like that. So yeah, I like that.
Thank you. We're quickly running out of time, so we have Jack, I think, was next, and then Basha, and then Dan. I think if we go in that order, then we can have a little bit of time left over for another question or two.
Thanks. Mary, I really liked what you said about dukkha. Another translation, from what I understand of the Sanskrit of that, is that it's like a wheel out of alignment with its axle. And there's kind of an objectivist quality to that we don't get it with a lot of subjectivist view, but there's something that the things are something that's off kilter, and it takes a different spin on what suffering is and things like that. But also you mentioned that, is flourishing even the right word? There's something about flourishing, the word, that is more maximizing than satisficing, and that satisficing maybe is underestimated. And that, which kind of gets to Gary, I just love, Gary, what you were saying about how if you want a survivable world, like this is like, in other words, just a survivable world, that's not a flourishing thing. But we need this concept, the universal concept of flourishing. That's just beautiful. It's elegant. It's just, and that somehow it has to be flexible. You're mentioning that flexibility, and that kind of, to me, tied back to what Josh was saying, toward what end? Ultimately, if we come up with some universal thing, will it be used toward hegemonic ends? I think it almost has to. I think that's the nature of anything that is good. Look at, we are the hegemon here. All right, we're coming up with this stuff to some degree, whether we like it or not. The difference is, one of the differences, how much humility are you bringing forth? Are you bringing forth these ideas? So like to say that as long as you treat everybody so that you don't hinder other people's freedoms. Well, that's easy to do if you've already got resources. What if you don't have resources? Is it just to then say to that person, don't try to take someone else's resources? I don't know. I can't answer that question so easily. So these are very, very difficult questions, but I think that I just want to reiterate the idea that this flexible kind of thing, and keeping in mind that we don't, and it's the hegemonic thing. It's just like, that's, maybe I'm seeing everything through that lens, but to just be mindful of that as we're putting forth our great ideas on flourishing. So thanks. Sorry.
Thank you.
Appreciate the reminder of humility. It's important not to sort of lay down the law for everybody.
I'm going to build off of that. I appreciate that. And I think there's a difference between looking at what are the sort of characteristics of flourishing and recognizing that we all have a desire to live well on our own terms. So that there's a desire for flourishing, there's a desire for well-being that looks different for other people. And that desire for living well could very well be, connected to this suffering as a fundamental part of the human conditioning. And so with that, I did want to put a small plug for a session that I'll be in and helped organize on freedom, agency, and well-being at the upcoming International Society for Theoretical Psychology conference, which I know some of you are going to be in. But more importantly, we draw on Nussbaum and the capabilities approach, which maybe Blaine, you maybe were referencing it when you mentioned the UN taking up, well-being as part of the way that it looks at and measures development in various countries. And what's, I think, interesting about the capabilities approach is that it is focused on, developing settings and social contexts that allow people to pursue well-being on their own turn, to have the resources and capabilities to pursue lives of, dignity and have access to resources that will allow them to pursue their desired trajectories. But what Nussbaum in particular, as a theorist in this approach, does is she does provide a list of 10 central capabilities that require a minimum threshold or provide the minimum threshold for all persons to achieve well-being. And these are her sort of criteria for social justice. And among them, she lists life, bodily health, bodily integrity, senses, imagination and thought, emotions, practical reason, affiliation with others, living with concern and in relation to other species, play, and political material control over one's environment. So, and she sort of proposes these as a way of opening the conversation about basic, capabilities we need in order to live a good life. And they're open to negotiation, but she sort of stands by proposing a basic list in order to not dissolve those characteristics to sort of a relative perspective. But I think what's interesting ultimately about the capabilities approach is that it is one that's taken up in various circles already, and it's grounded in various political theories, but also one that really respects or tries to respect the idea that a life of dignity looks different for different people, and how do we build policy to Josh's point, that respects that looks differently for different people, and people have resources to pursue their desired lives. So maybe it's something to consider in the discussion. And come see the presentation.
Maybe we can hear from Dan, and then we'll move on to another question. I'd really like to get to the one Lucas wants to ask.
Sure, thanks. Wanted to actually go back to what Josh was saying, to bring up this issue. I mean, I heard both Jack gave the answer of humility. I heard Monica give something that I'll call mutual respect. But I'm wondering, if I'm thinking about the comprehensive soldier fitness and Seligman's contributions to it, and I'm asking, how can this be used? And knowing that part of what Seligman wants to do is to be able to make soldiers who can deal with the horrors of war and still be able to thrive, I think there's a profound question there. Should you be able to kill and still be able to flourish? And so I'm wondering what sort of, what in this field that I'm not familiar with, when do you say, no, this is not a context where you should be flourishing. This is a check on it. You should not be doing well right now. And is there a place in when would you make that call?
Feel okay about taking that, Alex, or?
So I think I'll pass to you, Blaine. I think I will pass to you on this one.
Okay. Well,
I
think,
actually have a response for that, if you don't mind.
Well, I'm really wanting to move on to
Okay.
Lucas's question because it's a key one for us.
Okay,
so
then
just
never
kind of
mind.
take charge in that respect. What I would say, Dan, first of all, is it's not my position to say who's flourishing and who's not. It's not up to me. The best we can do is, I think, describe some things that we think might be characteristic of a good life. And then people are going to work that out in their own way. I don't see a place for prescription here at all. And that's part of the humility that Jack talked about too, is that even if I become an expert in this, or if I'm considered an expert in this, that doesn't mean I have any kind of final word or ability to judge other people's lives. And I think that's real important because we worry about that. And I think we worry about it rightly. So Lucas, I'm thinking about question number 5 there. Would you bring that up to the group and let's see what people think?
Sure. So setting aside the question of whether a universal theory is desirable, we can ask ourselves, what are the requirements for a universal theory epistemically, among other things? So how would you ground such a theory? That's the question. What will it take to have a universal theory? What would it require?
Another way to put that would be, what would convince you? If we present a universal theory, what would we have to do to convince you that it's reasonably correct?
I see a hand up, but my screen is kind of, I see there's a hand up. Who's that?
Doesn't say my name, sorry. My name
It's
is
Professor of Theoretical and Philosophical.
Yeah, that's my last name there. At least it has been this year. Well, I sort of typed this in chat, but I think that question, Lucas, that you raised about whether we can be wrong about flourishing is really like an absolutely core question to answer that, right? Because if you can't, right, if what flourishing is just what you want, which I don't think it is, but if it is, then I don't think there can be a universal account, because I doubt that you could name a single thing that everyone in the world would endorse as good or bad. Like, we've made various lists today, and for every item that was listed, I could instantly think of an example that was a counterexample, right? Like, for example, not being homeless. I've met a number of people for a whole range of different reasons who wanted to be homeless, for principled reasons, for reasons that didn't seem to make sense to me, but that did to that person. So I think if we have, I don't think a universal account even makes sense unless flourishing is something more than just what we want.
Right, and that gets back to your original comment about the isomorphism between flourishing and values. And I think it even gets to the comment about the comprehensive soldier fitness program, because some people think it would be a very good thing if soldiers can kill and remain happy. And I don't know, it gets at this provocative question. So can we be wrong about our own flourishing?
Well, Lucas, I think it would depend on how you're using the term our. But what do you mean by our own flourishing? Because of course, uh, if we go on this individualistic route, then we have the same problem that Freud talked about and James talked about 20 years ago. If you go our as a community, then we don't get away from class struggle, right? So it depends how you mean our and what you're talking about there would be kind of my opinion. Because the position I take is that we won't get off the ground if we think about flourishing as an individualist phenomena, and we won't get off the ground if we think of it as a community phenomena, right? It's not, we go from this individualist to the super organic space, but these are phenomena that are likely in between. They're liminal phenomena, right? That's the position I take, and it's not a thing. Like flourishing is not a thing, like Basha says. It's a practice. It's an activity. So we have to kind of interrogate our and where that lands, because Gary, I think, gives us a great vision. We need some sort of telos, but we don't need a telos that allows for hegemony or the American telos has wreaked havoc on the world already, right? Like enough, right? It's not going well, and so we need something. But how do we conceptualize it in ways that don't immediately shift into tools like Josh says for violence?
Jack, did you have something you want to say to that?
Yeah, as you've guessed by now, I usually do. Sorry, but so the idea of arriving at like some universal account of flourishing that we could write down on a note card or tweet somewhere and just have with us. Yeah, okay, that's a little far-fetched. So I wonder if it's something like Alistair McIntyre says about the good life, that the good life is the life spent pursuing the good life, that the point is not so much to come up with that final answer, but that here we are doing our best to try to come up, it's the movement toward this universal, in which I would say whether you're moving toward a universal or whether you're moving toward a contextual, it doesn't matter anyway. We're going to do both. That's what knowledge does. It integrates and it differentiates. So either you're going to universal or highly contextualized to the point where you get to each little individual person actually and in their mood at their stage of development. You know, it's like where does the contextualizing stop? Those might be the wrong questions. They're placeholder questions for the process that we're engaging in and understanding the good. And so maybe it's just the process of striving toward that is somewhere is the benefit rather than any particular answer we might have. So.
That's been a theme of our conversation. I think one of them have been many themes. One of the themes has been that it probably doesn't make a lot of sense to look for a state or an achievement or a particular thing when it comes to flourishing. It's more about maybe thinking about it as a way of life or as a process or as part of becoming human in a sense, one might say, that can't be ever finally achieved. One of the favorite quotes of Aristotle is, he quoted Solon saying, call no person happy until that person is dead. And the idea being that not that dead people are happy, but that the life isn't the life of a eudaimon as long as it's ongoing, because it could always be spoiled. It could be spoiled by famine or plague or terrible wars or terrible hegemony, whatever. There are lots of ways to spoil lives. And so that's the idea of it being something that is a whole life rather than a bit of a life. Or a moment in time, or an achievement. Let me take charge here a little bit, if you will. I want to thank you all for participating in this and giving of yourselves so freely and putting your views and your opinions and your thoughts out there where people can savage them if they want to, or can appreciate them if they want to, or can incorporate them if they want to. It's really nice to have a group of really smart people who are as engaged as you have been in this process. I'm looking at, I think we got up to a high point of 21 people and we have 20 now. That's pretty good staying power, because I don't know how many of these you've been in, but I've been in a lot of them that by the end of an hour and a half, there's only 3 people left. So I really appreciate the level of engagement and appreciate your input. I've been taking some notes. The reason I wanted to record it is that I would like to have a record of what we said so we can go back to it, because really the way I presented this in the beginning is that we're here to pick your brains, and we're not really here so much to offer answers as questions. And I think that you as a group have really taken up that spirit in a really nice way and have provided us with a lot of things to think about and a lot of grist for our mill. We're a ways away from a universal account, as you might guess, but the idea is, you know, can it be done? Should it be done? How could it be done? What would it look like? Those are ideas that are all very alive to us, and we're grappling with them now. And so this particular conversation comes at a really good time when we're in the midst of doing that grappling. And so your input is probably more appreciated than you know. I mean, in a way, it's easy to drop in and just say what's on your mind, but in another way, you've been really responsive to the questions and to the topic itself. So it's far more than casual conversation in my view. So my benediction didn't take that long, but I just wanted to share with you my appreciation, our appreciation for your participation. Maybe you have a longer benediction, Masha?
Can I just ask one question? I know we have, yeah, I'm just curious. I appreciate this conversation too. It's delightful. I learned a lot from everyone. I'm curious how this conversation sort of, I don't know, for lack of better words, squares up with your book though, Blaine, and how, you know, we've taken up the issues here, and I will order it. It's now on my list, but I haven't read it. So I'm curious how you see some relations.
Okay, yes, my apologies for the shameless pitch, but couldn't help myself. Well, first of all, I guess I have to make a confession. So all the things we've criticized other flourishing researchers for, I've done them too. So I've been pretty monocultural in my focus. I've made a lot of assumptions, made a fair number of claims that weren't necessarily well justified theoretically. So we had an opportunity about 1.5 years ago to study these questions more thoroughly. And I immediately recognized the value of doing that and recognized the error of my ways and many other people's ways. So it was really a clarifying moment when this became available. The book, Frailty, Suffering, and Vice, is not quite as monocultural as many things, but it's also not really a cultural work. So if you go in there looking for different like examples of people in different places and how they manage or deal with suffering or frailty, you're probably not going to find it's going to be pretty much about people in the United States. We have a lot of practical examples, and the stories are all residents of the United States. I'm not sure, we may have an immigrant or two in there, but I'm not even sure of that. So I have to confess that I'm guilty of all the sins that I've mentioned today. And a whole lot more, but I'm not going to tell you about.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
It's still worthy of a read, clearly though. So thank you.
Yeah, I think it's, well, yeah, clearly because I wrote it and organized it and pitched it, I think so too. It's one of those things that was partly a response to the happyology that has been a big part of positive psychology. That it's just really clear to me that these are important parts of life, and you can't just smile to rub them out and wipe them out. That in certain ways, the frailties we experience and the challenges we experience are the pathway to flourishing. It's not as though we just need to minimize them and avoid them to the extent possible, but that we need to live through them. And the example that I often use is the example of loss. All of us are going to lose people we love. We probably have already lost people we love. And that's painful. It hurts. It means we don't get to have them in our lives anymore in the same way. They're memories. And so to me, the grief process is one that's really important. It's important to honor them through grief. And that's the way, part of the way we honor their memory. So it's not as though we want to just get through this and the stages of grief in 6 weeks and be done. I don't think to me, that's a dishonoring approach to loss. On the other hand, we find over time, at least most of us, that these losses are less acute. They take over less of our brains, our minds than they used to, but they remain there. So we still think about people we've lost many years ago. To me, that's a way of honoring them. And so that's part of the virtue of friendship, or part of the virtue of being part of a community. So yeah, I'm a big believer in this, and I just, I would lose faith entirely in the idea of flourishing if it meant that I needed to have some sort of perfect flourishing or absence of loss or suffering to get there. That doesn't make any sense to me. It means then I'd need to do something else, maybe sell shoes or something, I don't know, but certainly not study something that's unattainable. So again, thank you very much for this, and I hope to see you all again soon sometime, and maybe we'll even get to see each other in person again. That would be fun. Because 3 dimensions are really fun.
Come to Minneapolis. I'll be there in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
Yeah,
we're planning on being there too.
Yeah.
We're planning to supply a few more answers in Minneapolis than we did here today. I don't know if that's an enticement or an impediment, but maybe we'll see you there.
Thank you, Blaine, and all of your fellow facilitators for a great discussion.
Thanks so much, folks. Take care. Oh, sorry, folks. I just can't work technology that well. I'll see you in Minneapolis, I suppose.
Okay, sounds good.
trying to find one button.
The red one.
I know. We should talk about flourishing and anti-flourishing through Zoom.
How does flourishing work in 2 dimensions?
Not very well.
Well, in all seriousness, though, that there's a really interesting connection here between about hyperreality and as something that is kind of toxic for flourishing, right? Technologically mediated hyperreality, Borgman from the mid-90s, and that whole kind of stuff on technology that creates a world that's too seamless that we can't find meaningful. Of course, impacted Taylor. It's interesting. There's that whole side of it, right? Where the flourishing requires messiness, I suppose. Right? I don't know.
There's a case to be made. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, good to see you face to face, Blaine. Thanks, Josh, for all your hard work.
Yeah, thanks for setting this up, Josh, and following through and all that stuff. It's great.
Blaine, do you want to stop the recording and see if you can save it to see if that works? Save it to your computer.